Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first ever podcast of Geeky Musings. It is All Hallows Eve, or Samhain. I can never pronounce that correctly, I'm sure. I'll have people yelling at me afterwards. Or, for those of you who prefer to stick to calendars, the 31st of October. The weather here in Tennessee has been pretty miserable, not gonna lie. It started off kind of, I don't say warm, but got cold pretty quickly, and certainly felt like a very bitter, almost winter day. Not even a fall day. My brother, who lives in Fairbanks, mentioned when I told him the temperature, he's like, "Oh, that's normal for Tennessee, right?" And I said, "Not really." So, anyways, since this is my first ever attempt at a podcast, I apologize in advance. And since this is also my first ever podcast, we're doing this live stream as well. I don't know if I'll get any audience in the live stream, but we might do additional podcasts as we go. Definitely be doing those. I am recording audio on this as well, so there will be audio production later. So, it is Halloween. It is trick or treat. When you think of Halloween, you think of ghosts and goblins. You think of spooky things. You think of the cat that's behind me on the chair right now. This is one of my supervisors, Buttercup. She will likely appear from time to time. If you're listening to the stream and not watching it, you're going to be wondering what the heck I'm talking about. One of my two resident cats has just decided to make a momentary appearance. Anyways, as I was saying, Halloween. You think of trick-or-treat, you think of the jack-o'-lanterns, you think of the spooky things, the ghosts, the goblins, the haunted houses. And as I was out driving this morning, running some errands, I got to thinking about Halloween and about horror movies in particular. And that tied in with a conversation that my brother and I had been having the other day. Kind of led me down this path of why don't we do a podcast? But second of all, why don't we talk about horror movies and talk about not the new horror movies, but let's talk about old horror movies, and specifically some of the actors who defined the genre. And, I very quickly could make a mental list. I made a list of about 5 names, actually 6 names, it's 5. I added a 6th later on. And, I thought about it, and I was like, these are probably some of the actors who really defined the horror genre for what it's become today, and for what it is now. And so we're going to talk about each of these actors and some of the work they did, and a little bit about the actual lives of these actors a bit as well, just to put some humanity behind the monsters, as it were. And my hope is when we're done, this will probably run about an hour, but when we're done, you should hopefully have a little bit better appreciation for the horror genre and for some of the very talented actors that were a part of the genre, and who helped kind of make it what it became, what it especially is today. Now, for those of you who are watching, I am going to do this. So rather than you having to see my face dominating the entire screen, I've actually got my research notes, which is mostly Wikipedia articles, I will admit, and some YouTube clips, pulled up, and so you'll be able to look at these a little bit with me here, kind of follow along as we talk over these people. If you are, participating live, if you're in the live stream, please feel free to, jump in the chat, ask questions. I will certainly answer them. But yes, so let's go ahead and get started here. And we're going to start off talking about someone who is known by the nickname the Man of 1,000 Faces. And that's Lon Chaney. And Lon Chaney he really helped get the horror genre launched. It's kind of funny because the horror genre for movies has existed as long as movies themselves. If you go back to the very first movies, within like a year, there were horror movies being made. One of the classics, obviously, is Frankenstein. That's one of the most made and remade movies, of all the works that have ever been created. So we're going to start off with Lon Chaney. His actual name was Leonidas Frank Chaney, but he went by Lon. And he was very active during the silent movies. That was his big thing. So that's why I wanted to start off with him. And we're going to specifically look at a few of his movies that he did. And I believe I have, yes, right here. We're going to look at some of the work, that went into them. So, Lon Chaney was born in Colorado. He was actually born to both parents were deaf. And so he learned pantomime at a very early age. He was big into vaudeville and theater acts. And, no one really knows for sure how he got into film. There's talk that there was a divorce that went down in Los Angeles. And he started doing bit parts for Universal Studios. But he rose to fame because of just how versatile of an actor he was. Now, again, this is silent films, so there's no voice. There's no talking, there's no conversation, there's nothing. It is purely, how you act, and more importantly, how you look. And this is really kind of the opening of movies, as we know them today. So if we take a look here, there were a number of films that he did where he had to play, different parts. So if we look, for example, let me find one here, if I can. You have the Wolfman. The Wolfman was one of his roles. You have this is from After Midnight. He's playing a very dark, sinister character. You have another classic, The Phantom of the Opera, where he's playing the part of the Phantom. There's London After Midnight right there. And in each of these movies, in each of these parts, he can play someone different. Here's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And you would never really believe that he could take all these individual parts that required all different makeup and could pull them off to perfection. He did Frankenstein, for example. I mentioned that there was Frankenstein was done. But again, he was very active, performed in so many works. He passed away very early in life. He died in 1930. Sorry, I was going to say 1929. And what was actually funny was his father preceded him only by 3 years. Apparently, he developed what was lung cancer and passed away in Los Angeles. Now, it was really interesting, and again, I have my crib sheets pulled up, so you kind of see what I'm seeing if you're doing the live stream right now. But the pallbearers at the funeral included the following names, and I'll tell you who some of these people were. You have Paul Bern, who was a German-American director and screenwriter for MGM. And he was, he won Best Picture posthumously in 1931. You have Hunt Stromberg, who was, a producer during Hollywood's golden age. He was responsible most notably for a long-running series of movies called the Thin Man series, which is a topic I'm going to really hit on another time, because the Thin Man is based off of a novel by a novelist who was big back in the 20s and 30s when he wrote, but today is largely obscure. And yet a lot of his works became movies. The Thin Man was one of them. The novelist, by the way, is a guy by the name of Dashiell Hammett. And one of his best-known works is The Maltese Falcon, which later became a movie starring Humphrey Bogart, also Peter Lorre, who we're going to talk about here a little later, Peter Lorre. But Stromberg was another MGM man, had some Academy Awards, and definitely, was one of the people who helped bring Hollywood, through its early days. So you have Paul Berg, you have Hunt Stromberg, you have Irving Thalberg. Irving Thalberg was another producer. He was called the Boy Wonder, and he was a part of MGM. Became head of production of MGM in 1925. He was responsible for a lot of stars getting their start in Hollywood. For example, I'll read off some of the list here: Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Lionel Barrymore. By the way, moving off onto a sidetrack here for a second, you've just heard the name Lionel Barrymore, and you're going, that last name sounds familiar. Is he related to Drew Barrymore? Lionel Barrymore was Drew Barrymore's great uncle. In fact, the Barrymores were considered one of the founding families of Hollywood because there were 3 Barrymores who were involved in acting. Again, this will probably be a topic for another day, but you may have heard the name and went, Drew. Yep, Drew is related to him. So Irving Thalberg. Louis B. Mayer. Louis Mayer was one of the co-founders of MGM. So you had him. Lionel Barrymore was a pallbearer. Wallace Beery was a pallbearer. Beery was another film and stage actor. He was very prolific during the silent period. 250 films in 36 years. In fact, his contract with MGM stated that he would be paid $1 more than the highest paid than any other contract player at the studio. So he would always be the highest paid actor at MGM. So like I was saying, you had him, you had Todd Browning. Todd Browning was a film actor, director, screenwriter, and vaudeville performer. One of his great works was the 1931 Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's a name on my list. And you had Lou Cody, who was another stage and film actor. He had a pretty decent run from 1914 to 1934. And Ramon Navarro, who was one of the first Mexican-born film, stage, and TV actors. And was really a big deal in the 20s and 30s. He did a number of pictures, up through really 1932-33 was when he kind of stopped. But he had performances as late as 1960, and did spend some time doing television as well. So those were all the pallbearers at Lon Chaney's funeral. And again, these were big names of the day. And not only that, but the Marine Corps provided both a chaplain and an honor guard for his funeral. Chaney had done a picture years prior, Tell It to the Marines. And it really endeared him with the Marines. So the Marines provided a chaplain and an honor guard. In fact, during the funeral, everyone had to observe, at MGM, had to observe 2 minutes of silence for the funeral. So that's how big Chaney was. And again, he got the title Man of a Thousand Faces because of all the different characters he could take on. And again, if you're watching the live stream, I'm just gonna go through some of these and let you see some of the different works. And I'll post some of this up on the blog at a later date, so everyone can see if you come back and listen to this later. But you have, here's the, let's see if that'll open up. I just want to see the picture. There's the Hunchback of Notre Dame. There you go. That came up. There's another one of his. It's from Mockery. Again, After Midnight. Here's kind of a montage of some of his work. So, anyways, so Lon Chaney was really kind of the first name on the list I wanted to touch on. And again, he was big during the silent period. Now we're going to shift gears here for a minute. We're going to move over to what I consider to be kind of the key 4 individuals who really took on horror, especially in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And really brought horror into kind of the golden realm, if you will. The first one we're going to look at is Bela Lugosi. And most of you have heard of Bela Lugosi. If you haven't, go look at the 1931 Dracula. And that right there, should be more than sufficient. When you think of Dracula, Bela Lugosi's image likely comes to mind. You have the slicked back hair. You have the widow's peak. You have the sharp nose, the sharp ears, the very chiseled face, the accent, the good evening. I am Count Dracula, and I'm doing a terrible accent. I know I am. That's Bela Lugosi. Okay, Lugosi, was originally born in Hungary, 1882. He came to the U.S. In 1919. He was active in politics. He had to flee Hungary because of that. He kind of came to fame. He'd done some early film work in Hungary. He did some additional film work in Germany. He came to New York and started doing Broadway a bit. And he was approached in 1927 to do a Broadway production of Dracula, which had been taken from Bram Stoker's novel, which was written in 1897. And the production was very successful. It ran for 261 performances. It did a run on the West Coast. It was produced by a gentleman by the name of Horace Liverite, alas, that neither he nor anyone else ever received any acclaim from this. From what I hear from the accounts of it, it was a very well run production. So anyway, Lugosi went out and did Dracula, and he does it for a couple years. And Fox Films hears about him. And they do a couple silent movies. And he does a few other films for Fox after another, short tour of the play of Dracula in the West Coast. Universal Pictures gets the right to the movie. And they pick Lugosi up. Now, he's not their first choice, and again, this is a long time ago, so we don't know who the studio chose originally, to do that performance. But eventually, they did go with Lugosi, and it was a big success. The film was a hit. Pull this up here real quick. It was directed by Todd Browning, and we've mentioned Browning's name already. He was the pallbearer at Lon Chaney's funeral. But Browning took on Dracula, did well with it. I'm looking through here. Yeah, it was generally well received by critics, and is considered to be, it was selected by preservation by the National Film Registry in 2000. It's considered to be one of the best movies of the time. So, again, a classic today. It was not necessarily to that acclaim back in the 30s, back in 31, but it certainly was a success. Anyways, so Lugosi goes off, he does Dracula. And after that, the horror genre just kind of picked up with Lugosi. I mean, you have a horror villain here. You have a heavily accented voice, that can do these parts, and someone who can appear menacing and foreboding, and that was Lugosi to a T. So, Lugosi continued with a number of movies. He took on Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1932, The Raven in 1935, and then Son of Frankenstein in 1939. Now, the next name on our list we're going to talk about will have a lot of bearing. Actually, the next couple names will have a fair amount of bearing into Son of Frankenstein. We'll get to that in a minute. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. But again, Lugosi continued to perform. He was largely typecast, and that was, in his mind, it was a detriment to him. So much so that in 1937, there was a what's called the Players Directory, which is published by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and he or his agent, basically put in the 1937 version of the Players Directory that he, the idea that he was only fit for horror films was, quote, an error, unquote. But again, Hollywood saw him in this role. They wanted to keep him in this role. But it was very rare that he ever played anything other than a horror villain. There were a few occasional movies where he did, but again, yeah. So, by the mid-30s, Lugosi was kind of in decline. He was still getting work, but the movies that he was in were more B unit movies. These were, back in the day, a movie would be, if you went to the theaters, there was the A movie and the B movie. It's kind of like a record. You had the first side, the A side, the B side. The A movie was the movie that had the big draw. The B movie was really, not much attention was paid to it, to how well it was done, anything else like that. So, mostly low budget stuff was what kind of wound up happening, or what would happen. So Lugosi, late 1930s, his roles really kind of started to decline. Some of this was, he'd had some injuries earlier in life. He unfortunately, started taking opioids, mostly or particularly morphine and methadone. That it's believed that he did become hooked on those, and that really didn't help his career any. It wasn't until the 50s, really, that he started to pick up a little bit. And a lot of that came because of a filmmaker named Ed Wood, who'd been a fan of his, and took him on, offered him roles, a lot of times in B-rated horror movies, but it was work, and Lugosi took it on. he did spend time as well in treatment, for his addiction to painkillers. Unfortunately, he did, obviously did pass away. He died of a heart attack in 1956. And he was buried wearing one of the Dracula cape costumes. What was kind of funny was that, he didn't make the request to be buried in a cape. The decision was made by his children. He had a child, Bela, G, Lugosi, and So that was Bela Lugosi. Again, he was a very interesting character in life and in death. You almost, again, if you think of Dracula, you will think of Bela Lugosi. Now, if we move along, so we've covered the second in our list. So we're going to move on to another great. Boris Karloff is considered to be another one of the greats. And Karloff, Karloff was around for quite some time. I mean, he was active up until his death in 1969. So Karloff got his start in 1909. He was actually, Karloff was English. He was British. He was born in Surrey, England. And he got his start in Hollywood, again, during the silent films. Now, he had a number of roles. He did some westerns. He, again, a lot of moving parts and pieces. And you'll find, if you look at his Wikipedia, for example, that he was very prolific during this time. During the teens, the 20s, the 30s. I can't really begin to count the sheer number of roles he took on during that time. So, anyways, we're gonna take a look at him now. And really, I mentioned earlier that Frankenstein was going to come into play. So, if Bela Lugosi is tied to Dracula, then the person you think of when it comes to when you relate them to Frankenstein is Karloff. Basically Boris Karloff was to Frankenstein what Bela Lugosi was to Dracula. And he'd already been in 80 movies when James Whale found him and cast him as Frankenstein's monster. Okay? And you have to realize that the costume was not easy to wear. Okay? The shoes themselves weighed 11 pounds each. So already he's going in with 11 pounds on each foot. And Lord only knows what the rest of the costume weighed. I'm going to, real quick again, for those of you on the live stream, I'm going to try to pull up some pictures via Google of Karloff, in the Frankenstein outfit. Here we go. Here's a good one right here. So, yeah, to give a little context here, again, everyone knows what Frankenstein's monster looked like. Karloff had to wear, so these were 11-pound shoes, and they were 4-inch platforms to boot. And you have to imagine trying to move around or walk around in those. It certainly was not an easy feat to do. So Frankenstein really kind of brought Karloff, into the limelight, as it were, from the perspective of horror movies. Again, if you look at his roles prior to that, there was a whole bunch of different pieces. There was, Hope Diamond Mystery, Dynamite Dan, Parisian Nights, The Greater Glory, Man in the Saddle, Two Arabian Nights. But Frankenstein really, really, really brings him into the fore for horror. It did take a little bit, but he continued. So Frankenstein's 1931. In 1932, and again, I'm going to give you guys the name of a movie, and you're going to say, oh, I know that movie. Not exactly. The Mummy. The Mummy has been remade a couple times already. And certainly, we all know the Brendan Fraser Mummy. I'm a big Brendan Fraser fan. I love his works. I wish he'd go back to acting. The 1932 Mummy was certainly far more horrific in a sense than the new Brendan Fraser Mummy, or even the newest Mummy, which I have yet to see. I don't want to disappoint myself. So let's look at the Mummy for a minute. 1932, and this was Karloff as the Mummy. So you have Boris Karloff, playing the monster again. And I've got a couple pictures, from the Wikipedia. Again, this stuff will probably wind up on the blog. Sorry, I had to take a drink real quick. For those of you who are not tuning into the live stream, so obviously in the Mummy, he goes through that transformation from the wrapped monster to, the more human-looking person. And I love this picture of Karloff, by the way. That was Karloff in makeup for the actual bandage wraps. Especially this picture right here. So, disregard that one. I'll go back to this one. That was Karloff. There we go. Sorry. This later picture, the one I just showed, was actually Lon Chaney Jr. Again, we just talked about Lon Chaney. I should have clarified his name as Lon Chaney Sr. Senior's son, also named Lon, took up his father's mantle, also did the Wolfman, and showed up in, some of the Mummy movies and everything else as well. So, in some ways, that kind of ran in the family. But anyways, I digress. Talking about Karloff and the Mummy for a minute. Another movie that, really kind of helped, accelerate his stature. The movie was, considered to be a pretty substantial success. It received good reviews from the critics. Rotten Tomatoes today gives it a 93% score based on 27 reviews. A lot of that was because of, some of it was what's the word I'm looking for? The feeling, if you will. It wasn't pure out-and-out horror, but it was that feeling of horror. Anyways, so Karloff does the Mummy. He takes on, a couple non-horrors, but, again, he winds up doing horror movies largely. Now, funny thing is, it was Karloff and Lugosi teaming up together from time to time. And they showed up, for example, they showed up in The Black Cat. They showed up in The Gift of Gab. They showed up in, I believe, Bride of Frankenstein, I believe they were both in. No, maybe not. Sorry. No, scratch that. Scratch Bride of Frankenstein. The Raven, that was the next one. So you have a number of movies that he and Lugosi appeared in. The Invisible Ray in 1936, he was with Lugosi. So again, there were a number of movies where Karloff and Bela Lugosi were playing together. Now, in 1934, what was called the Motion Picture Production Code, the Hays Code, really started to become enforced. And the Hays Code was kind of put in place to, in an effort to bring morality into the movie theater, if you will. So movies had to go through censors. It was kind of the precursor to today's movie rating system, if you will. I do believe that was the Motion Picture Production Code was kind of the predecessor to that. So for a while, horror movies kind of dropped off. But in '39, you had Son of Frankenstein made an appearance. He did with Basil Rathbone and Bela Lugosi. You had several other movies that he did as well. So, Karloff continued into the 40s. He did House of Frankenstein. He wasn't considered to be as successful with The Climax, which was in '44 as well. You had The Body Snatcher, Isle of the Dead, Bedlam, and he left Universal Studios in part because he felt that the Frankenstein franchise had run its course, and most of what he was dealing with were B pictures, and it was really, for Karloff, he kind of dealt with the same thing that Lugosi dealt with, where he wanted to get into other things besides horror. And for Karloff, Karloff did kind of look at ways to do that, where Lugosi became addicted to painkillers and went through all this trouble. Karloff took a different approach to things. And what he did was he did radio shows. So he did a series called Lights Out. In 1949, he did a radio series called Starring Boris Karloff. He was on the stage as well. He did make some film appearances also. A lot of that as well, though, was horror movies started to drop off following the World War II. So Karloff, was kind of in a bind there. And, it wasn't until really kind of the late 50s that horror started to make a comeback. And late 50s going into the 60s. And it was really, that was when he started to come back in horror, and the horror genre started to pick up. But it was really American International Pictures that picked the horror genre up in the early 60s and really kind of ran with it for a while. And that was where Karloff, did several pictures. The Terror, Comedy of Terrors, Die Monster Die, The Raven, which again we're also going to talk about here in a minute. Now, he did have one very notable speaking role. Again, Karloff had a very distinct voice. And if you hear his voice, you know it. Well, Karloff, in the mid-1960s, narrated Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. He did not sing You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, which I almost started to sing because I love that song. And that was Thurl Ravenscroft. But Karloff narrated it. And he received a Grammy for Best Recording for Children after it was released. Now, Karloff died in 1969. He developed bad emphysema. He'd been a very heavy smoker. His emphysema was so bad that only one half of one lung still worked when he passed away. He was cremated, and he did have 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, one for motion pictures, one for television. So, he was very well respected, very well liked in his time at Hollywood. So that is Boris Karloff. Now, in the time remaining, we've got to cover a few names. So I've been a little slow to this point. We're going to move faster, or try to. So, let's move on to Peter Lorre. Now, when you think of, how do I describe it? When you think of mad scientists, Lorre's visage may come to mind. Lorre was kind of a wide, goggly-eyed character. He was very suave. Again, if you're watching the live stream, I've got pictures of him pulled up right now. He was very suave, very, very debonair of sorts. Clearly had a little bit of a, evil genius touch to him. And Lorre, Lorre was also, he came from Hungary as well, and he'd started off on the stage. He began in Vienna. He came to Germany. He left Germany when Hitler took power. His first English language film, believe it or not, was an Alfred Hitchcock movie called The Man Who Knew Too Much. And later he settled into into Hollywood. He played the villain in some movies. He was typecast as a sinister foreigner. If you look at Mad Love, Crime and Punishment, he was playing murderers there. One of the big movies that he was in, and I mentioned this movie earlier, was in The Maltese Falcon. And that was in 1941. But we're going to back up for a second here, because Lorre actually crossed paths earlier with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in 1940 in the movie You'll Find Out. This was it was nominated for Best Original Song, I'd Know You Anywhere. It was kind of a horror comedy. You had, like I said, you had Lorre, you had Karloff, you had Lugosi in there. But again, one of the big pictures that he did was The Maltese Falcon, where he played the role of Joel Cairo. And he did really well at that, and he was kind of the suave, dashing villain, if you will. And that movie kind of ended a run of B parts for him, and he wound up, working with Warner Brothers during this time. So, with the Maltese Falcon, like I said, that starred Humphrey Bogart. It had Humphrey Bogart, Sidney Greenstreet, Claude Rains. And, he worked again with Bogart in Casablanca in 1942. It was a relatively small part, but an important part all the same. He did, a couple other movies, Background of Danger, Passage to Marseille, which had Humphrey Bogart in it again. He had a number of roles. And, he had another really great role in the movie version of Arsenic and Old Lace, which, kind of funny enough, was a theater production that Lugosi and Karloff both did at various times. So I begin to think that if you wanted to be a horror star, you had to perform in Arsenic and Old Lace. Following World War II, again, he kind of had a downturn also. He did get some roles. He did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He did Five Fingers. In his final years, he worked on, Tales of Terror, The Raven. Those were AIP movies. Lorre passed away in 1964. He had a stroke. One of the issues in his life was, again, he had also become addicted to morphine. And just like Lugosi, he struggled with that addiction. Lorre has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and I believe Lugosi and Chaney both have them as well. So, if you if you see a picture of Lorre, it's hard not to think of him, in horror, because he did do several horror movies. He wasn't quite as prolific as some of the others, but was definitely involved. Now, we're going to swing our attention around here for a minute, and we're going to go to another one of the greats. If you look at the list of greats, and you start at the beginning, at the start of Hollywood, you'd have Lon Chaney, you'd have Bela Lugosi, you'd have Boris Karloff, and then you'd have Vincent Price. Lorre is kind of a secondary piece in this, but you have Vincent Price, and I've saved Price for later on to kind of give us a chance to work into him. Okay, Vincent Price, very suave, very dashing, 100 films. I liked him the first time I saw him, which was actually on the Muppet Show, believe it or not. And Price has a very long and storied history of all the actors we talk about here. I think Price is probably one of the most interesting and one of the most complete. I've already written a blog article on him at one point in time. I could probably do an entire podcast on him, but I'm going to kind of hit the high points. Price was born in St. Louis, Missouri, 1911. He was one of the younger ones in Hollywood at this time when horror was coming into being. His father or his grandfather rather, had invented Dr. Price's baking powder, which was a cream of tartar-based baking powder, and basically the family was very well-to-do. Vincent attended Yale and started off as a character actor in movies. Again, Chaney, Lugosi, Karloff, Lorre they're all there at the start, in the silent pictures just about. Price is one of the first of the second generation. Okay? And you see him early on doing, some interesting bit pieces, Brigham Young, Song of Bernadette, Keys of the Kingdom. But he also ventures into the horror genre and very early on crosses paths with Boris Karloff. Tower of London, 1939. He, later on, he has a few other pieces here. I'm trying to find something. Oh, never mind. He does a number of film noirs, but really it's not until the 60s that he begins to get into the horror genre full-fledged. If Chaney, Lugosi, and Karloff are the founders of horror, Vincent Price is the one who brings it back from the grave. And I'm using that pun intentionally. American International Pictures kind of starts up, and they get the rights to Edgar Allan Poe's works. And what they do is they basically say, okay, we're going to make these movies, and we're going to make them cheap, and we're going to make them fast. These are B flicks, basically, okay? And you're starting with, you have The House of Usher, you have The Pit and the Pendulum, Tale of Terrors, Comedy of Terrors, The Raven, Mask of the Red Death, Tomb of Ligeia, okay? All of these are low budget, they're American International Pictures, AIP, okay, and they're relatively decent successes. House of Usher is $2 million at the box office, which for that time, for 1960, is a pretty decent return. Pit and the Pendulum comes out in 61 on a $300,000 budget, and $2 million is what it makes. So it nets a $1.7 million profit right there. House of Usher was $300,000, and like I said, it turned $2 million roughly. Tales of Terror was, they don't say how much the budget was. I'm sure it was $300,000. It comes back with 1.5. Comedy of Terrors, they don't say. The Raven was 1.5 on a $350,000 budget. Mask of the Red Death, they don't say. Tomb of Ligeia, they don't say, but its budget was only $150,000. So basically, these movies right here, cheap, and they come out really fast, like clockwork. He does The Last Man on Earth, which, by the way, if you haven't watched it, you should. It's a horror movie, but he's not playing the villain. He's not playing the monster. Okay, he's actually playing the good guy. And the reason I suggest this movie is because it is based off of a novel, and you will know this. You will know what I'm talking about in a second. Called I Am Legend, and many of you will think of Will Smith. Okay, I will tell you right now, the Will Smith version of I Am Legend is nothing like the original book. And you should, if you don't read the book, go find The Last Man on Earth and watch it. Trust me, it is good. Vincent Price did a number of funnier movies as well. He went back to horror, The Abominable Dr. Phibes Rises Again, Theater of Blood. He did a number of the horror genre. Price crossed paths with Lorre on a couple occasions, crossed paths with Karloff, crossed paths with Lugosi. So the older generation and the newer generation crossed paths before. One of the best movies where they crossed paths was done in 1963, and it's called The Raven. And it's billed as the macabre masterpiece of terror. But let me tell you right now, guys, this is comedic horror. This is good stuff. And this is Vincent Price and Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff, and one of Karloff's last works, and another movie worth watching. Okay, it was definitely worth seeing. Okay, so again, Price does a number of movies, both good movies, horror movies, you name it. One of the last things he did was he was in Edward Scissorhands in 1990. But before that, I'm sure everyone has heard the song Thriller by Michael Jackson. If you listen to the full version of Thriller, there's a spoken word piece at the beginning and at the end, a spoken word sequence. That is Vincent Price, right there. Thriller went on to, do, I think it was a really big hit, on the charts. It was, top 10 single, and I'm trying to dig up the information here real quick, but yeah, that was Vincent Price's voice at the beginning and at the end. Now, again, I could do an entire podcast on Price. I'm not going to at the moment, but let me just leave it at this for now about Vincent Price. The man died in 1993. He was 82 years old. Okay? When he died, and again, he died of emphysema. So, yes, there was that. Okay? Price left large amounts of art with the East Los Angeles College. 2,000 pieces in excess of $5 million, I believe it was, or at least 2,000 pieces were donated by him and his wife. Okay, he produced cookbooks. Okay, the man was not just an actor. He was not just didn't just do voices. He did everything. I swear, he did everything. Okay, we'll do a deeper dive into Vincent Price another time. We've got about 5-6 minutes left, so I want to cover our last name, which is Basil Rathbone. And Rathbone, I believe I've done a short blog article on as well. Rathbone is but for different reasons. You do not think of horror when you think of Basil Rathbone. You think of Sherlock Holmes. This has been covered in one of my blog articles. You think of Sherlock Holmes. But early in Rathbone's career, Rathbone crossed paths with several names. Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in Son of Frankenstein. Rathbone also had some occasional returns following his Sherlock Holmes moments, where he did go back to the horror genre. One of these was called The Comedy of Terrors, which I've pulled up. You can watch the trailer on YouTube. I've got it pulled up right now. It's part of hilariously enough, the Vincent Price collection. But he was in Comedy of Terrors. He was in Tower of London, which also had Karloff and Vincent Price in it. So he certainly did several horror movies as well. He did Tales of Terror. He was also a big fan of the horror genre. He did an anthology called Basil Rathbone Selects Strange Tales. Again, another interesting character. Again, I like Rathbone for other reasons. He died, in my opinion, kind of before his time a little bit. He died at the age of 75. He had a heart attack and just one day and just passed away. He has 3 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, 1 for films, 1 for radio, 1 for television. So, that's our big, I don't want to say the big 6 of the horror genre, but those are, if you look at them, they're kind of the 6 key people in the horror genre. So again, just to recap everything, we started off talking about Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, who was really prolific during the silent run, during the silent era. Okay? And Chaney, that was his start. We proceeded from there to Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi really brought the role of Dracula to life. He started off in silence as well and moved on from there. Boris Karloff, we talked about. What Lugosi did for Dracula, Karloff did for Frankenstein's monster. That was one of his big claims to fame. Peter Lorre, who, again, was maybe more of the cerebral horror, one of the cerebral horror actors, less the monster, outwardly and more the monster inwardly. Vincent Price, who I think also kind of embodied the cerebral monster element. And then Basil Rathbone, who, is maybe out of order chronologically a little bit, but I wanted to list him in there simply because he did have, various horror appearances, and he does pop up, again, with the big 3, the big 4 in horror from time to time. They certainly walked in interesting circles, no two ways about that. So, I hope everyone enjoyed the podcast this evening. Thank you guys. If you attended the live stream or if you're going to watch the live stream later on, thank you for being a part of that. If you're listening to this, I hope you enjoyed. Again, apologies, since this is the first podcast of what may or may not be many. We'll see. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, anything like that, please feel free to share them. If you're coming to this from somewhere else, the blog's website is metgeek.com. That's metgeek.com. You can email me, metgeek@metgeek.com. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a fantastic and terrific All Hallows Eve. Make sure you enjoy yourself trick-or-treating if you're going trick-or-treating. If not, put in a horror movie and enjoy it. I'll be sitting here with my bag of Reese's miniatures, which I'm showing off to the camera right now. Watching horror movies, perhaps, or something along those lines. So, until next time, everyone have a wonderful time, and talk to you later.